Good afternoon. This is Daniel here with Cop Watch TV. We're going to talk about and get into our last show of 2023. So we're just going to go ahead and get right into it. The first case that we're going to cover today is a case that happened back in April of this past year. However, the body camera footage just came out. It involves an individual, a 78-year-old named Cesar Robinson. Now, one of the reasons why I've been tracking this case and we're talking about this case is because after the officer-involved shooting, there were marches and there were protests and there were people screaming in the streets basically saying that this was an unlawful officer-involved shooting and that they wanted the police officers to be fired and held accountable. Well, now we have the body camera footage, and those same people who were screaming and yelling in the streets and protesting and demanding that the police be held accountable, well, now that we have the body camera footage, those very same people, they're silent. They aren't saying a whole lot. And I guess that's their apology. So here's what happened in this case. Again, it was back in April of this past year. Police officers responded to reports of a burglary over at the apartment of Cesar Robinson, who again is a 78-year-old man. Now, there is some dispute about, in some of the media reports that I've read about say that Mr. Robinson's nephew called for police officers. Other reports say that Mr. Robinson himself is the one who called for police officers. Either way, police officers weren't just bored and had nothing better to do and just showed up randomly at Mr. Robinson's house. Either way, police officers were called to Mr. Robinson's apartment in reference to a burglary that had occurred. So police officers arrive on scene. When they get there, they knock on the door and they ring the doorbell. And as the door starts to open, one of the police officers starts a sentence with the word "sir." It seems like the police officer was expecting to, talk to someone who had just been the victim of a burglary and was, going to contact him and talk to him in a normal, cordial way, again, by calling him sir. However, as soon as the door fully swings open, Mr. Robinson is holding a gun in his left hand. The gun is pointed directly at police officers. The police officers go from addressing him calmly as saying sir to yelling "oh fuck" because they realize that a gun is pointed directly at one of the officers. Mr. Robinson then takes a couple steps out of the door towards the police officers, and it's at that point that police officers utilized deadly force. Again, that's what happened in the body camera video, and there were still some people who were, complaining about this officer-involved shooting, and here are some of the things that they've talked about. They said, well, did Mr. Robinson even know that it was the police officers who were at the door? He had just been the victim of a burglary, so it's reasonable that Mr. Robinson might answer the door holding a gun. Well, let's address that in a couple different ways. First of all, Mr. Robinson has eyes, so he can see that it's uniformed police officers. Also, he has a peephole, so he could have looked out the door to see who exactly was there. If Mr. Robinson wasn't sure, he could have, when the doorbell rang and, the officers knocked at the door, he could have yelled and asked who it was. There's a lot of different things that Mr. Robinson could have done besides not only answer the door with a gun in his hand, but have the gun pointed at police officers and then take 2 steps towards the police officers with the gun. And it's just one of those things that when you have a gun pointed at you, the time for negotiation and de-escalation, that time has passed because your life may have only moments left to it and the time to de-escalate has passed. So this is undoubtedly a justified officer-involved shooting. And again, there were weeks and months of protests about this shooting. So I hope that the individuals, not counting on it, but I kind of hope that the individuals who were saying that not only were they saying that NYPD was lying, not only were they saying that Mr. Robinson did not point a gun at police officers, but also saying that this is a case where the police officers could have done anything else, and you can't. When a gun is pointed at you, whether you're a citizen or you are a police officer, that's an immediate deadly threat, and the way that police officers should respond is with immediate deadly force. Now, the next case that we're going to talk about, and this is a case where this is a controversial case, and we've had cases like this before, and I've got an issue with them, and it's difficult for me to say that this is a justified officer-involved shooting. Now, if we break it down, maybe we can get there, but to me, this shooting is absolutely problematic. And again, we don't just cover officer-involved shootings in cases where the police officers did the right thing. We're going to talk about cases just like we do every week where, there's some question as to whether what the police officers did. Those are the most interesting cases, and that's why I like to cover cases like this. So this happened last week in Mesquite, Texas. There was an officer-involved shooting where police officers shot and killed a 19-year-old named Payton Lawrence. So basically, here's what happened happened with this case. Police officer was on random patrol in this town of Mesquite, Texas. For whatever reason, as the police officer was driving around at night, he noticed two vehicles that were kind of following each other. There was a Hyundai that appeared like it was being followed pretty closely by a Chrysler. As the vehicle passed the officer, and again, there wasn't a whole lot of traffic in the area, and the officer took note of that and saw which direction. After the officer passed the Hyundai and the Chrysler, the officer took note of where those vehicles went. Well, just then over the radio, it came out that there was a silver Hyundai vehicle, which was the exact description of the vehicle that the officer had just saw, that there was a silver Hyundai vehicle driving in that area that had just been stolen, or reports of a stolen vehicle. So the officer thought, I just saw a vehicle matching that description in that same area. I saw where they went. I'm going to try to go and find them. So a police officer went down the road, and there happens to be a gas station right there. Police officer notices in the gas station that there's that same silver Hyundai vehicle that's parked at a gas pump, and there's actually no one in that car. And then the officer, right directly next to it, the officer sees the Chrysler that was following that vehicle. So the officer thinks, okay, this is quite possibly the stolen vehicle, and I saw this vehicle following it. So the people who now the vehicle has like 5 people in it. So the 5 people who are in this Chrysler probably had something to do with that stolen Hyundai. Now, this does give the police officer reasonable suspicion to detain the individuals in the Chrysler. Now, of course, that doesn't give the officer probable cause to arrest. It doesn't mean they're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But in order to detain, all police officers need is reasonable suspicion. And yes, there was reasonable suspicion to detain the individuals in the vehicle at this point. Now, what the police officer does is the police officer exits his vehicle, and he goes and he stands directly in front of the Chrysler, directly in front of the vehicle. He draws out his weapon, points at the driver, and starts giving the driver commands. He starts telling the driver to stop, to put his hands on the steering wheel, all of those types of things. The driver of the vehicle was a 19-year-old named Payton Lawrence. Instead of following those directions, what Payton Lawrence does is he moves forward. Now, we've had cases where it looks like an individual is, there's a police officer standing in front of the car, and that the driver tries to go around the police officer or tries to go quickly around the police officer, and there's some question as to whether or not the police officer's life is in immediate danger. However, this case is a little bit different, and we have surveillance camera video where we can see exactly what happened. So the officer's in front of the vehicle. Payton Lawrence, the driver, he does move forward slowly a couple feet, and then Payton Lawrence backs up. And when he backs up, it seems like he's trying to angle the vehicle and position the vehicle so he could basically flee the scene, which isn't good, but flee the scene and not hit the police officer. Otherwise, he just would have gone forward one time quickly at a high rate of speed. That isn't what Mr. Lawrence did. So he went forward a couple feet really slow, then he backed up, and then as the vehicle is going back and forth, the officer standing in front of the vehicle, he's basically taking a few steps forward and backwards with the vehicle. The officer does give commands for Mr. Lawrence to stop. So it's not ambiguous, or Mr. Lawrence wasn't confused about what the police officer pointing a gun at him wanted him to do. However, Mr. Lawrence then decided to creep forward a couple more feet. As Mr. Lawrence did that, the police officer did fire 3 rounds, killing the 19-year-old driver. I just have to say, I've got a pretty big issue with this, and I think a lot of people do as well. Now, again, this is a tactical error from the police officer, because there is no situation where a police officer, almost no situation, where a police officer should purposely stand in front of a vehicle. It's stupid, it's idiotic, and it's a property crime. So, one, it's incredibly dangerous for a police officer to do this, because if a car is moving forward at a high rate of speed or a medium rate of speed, that is obviously a deadly threat. So the police officer is basically putting himself in a situation, so it's kind of officer-induced. He's putting himself in a situation where he could be hurt or killed over a property crime. A property crime. This is completely insane. Most police departments have policies that directly prohibit police officers from doing this, and this is a good reason. Yes, I do not think the officer should have done that. All of this overarching, of course, Mr. Lawrence, not only should he not have stolen a car, but also he shouldn't have tried to flee from police officers. That's a bad idea. That doesn't make any sense. But we're looking at right now what the actions of the police officer were. And again, the officer should not have put himself in that position. The car was moving slowly. Now, of course, if I were the defense attorney for the officer or representing the officer in some type of administrative action, what I would say is yes, the officer officer was detaining someone who was, the suspect. There was reasonable suspicion of a felony, and the officer was standing in front of the car to make sure that the felony suspect didn't get away. And the reason that the officer utilized deadly force is because, well, yes, of course, that like at the time that the shooting happened, yes, the officer, the vehicle wasn't driving fast, wasn't revving the engine, but from going from a slow speed to the driver putting just a little more pressure onto that gas pedal, that easily could have run over the officer, and that could have been an immediate deadly threat, and the officer was trying to avoid that because it only takes a quarter of a second to press your foot down further on the gas pedal. The reason I'm covering this case is because if we're going to talk about, we have to talk about the bad officer involved shootings and be honest about them, if people are going to listen to us talk about the good officer involved shooting. So I'm not saying that this shooting was illegal. I'm not saying that the officer should be charged. I think we need more investigation to see exactly what the officer was thinking. I haven't seen the body camera footage on this yet, but again, we just have surveillance camera video. What we do know, though, is that it was a bad idea. Whether it's against the department policy, I don't know. There should be a department policy against police officers doing this. Now, let's talk about what the officer probably should have done. So here's a situation where you have a suspected stolen vehicle, and you have people inside the vehicle. Okay, that's a felony. We do want police officers to go after felonies. Well, the officer was by himself. So what probably would have made sense is, maybe the officer hang out at either down the street or at the other side of the parking lot. If that vehicle tries to get back up there as quickly as possible. Once backup is there, then conduct a felony stop, which is essentially a traffic stop with usually 2 or 3 police cars where the officers, if they get the car stopped, then they basically use the PA system to get everybody out of the car at gunpoint, and that's typically what you do for a stolen car. Well, what some people are going to say is, well, what happens if the car flees? Well, that's good thing. We actually have laws and policies around that. So there are some police departments and in some states where they're going to chase until the wheels fall off. So if you're in Arkansas and you're in a stolen vehicle, yeah, you're probably not going anywhere because the officers are going to chase you until there's nothing left of your car. But a lot of police departments have policies to deal with that, and they basically say that, hey, if a vehicle if it's a stolen vehicle, that's a property crime, we're not going to let you get into a pursuit over a property crime. Some police departments say, well, kind of depends. If it's the middle of the night and there's no traffic and they're only doing 5 miles over the speed limit and it's not really dangerous, we'll let you chase for that. As opposed to it being, the middle of the day in a big city doing 30 miles over the speed limit. So, but that's policy depending. I guess my point is that if there are police department policies that saying you cannot chase a car for this particular crime, then it's also probably a good idea to not stand in front of a car with your body, put yourself in that position. So again, this kind of seems like officer-induced jeopardy. Police officers need to stop standing in front of cars. It's just fucking stupid, and it's absolutely ridiculous, and we shouldn't be doing those kinds of things. Okay, before we get into some of the top stories of 2023 and some of the stories that I'm looking at going into 2024, the last officer involved shooting them to talk about that I do think is objectively reasonable happened on December 8th, I believe, in Louisville, Kentucky, involving an individual named Marvin Smith. So this is a case where officers with the Criminal Interdiction Division, so they are in uniform or they are marked up as police officers, but these aren't patrol officers. These are essentially detectives with the Criminal Interdiction Division, and they did a traffic stop on a vehicle. Listen, if you're being stopped by detectives with the Criminal Interdiction Division, it's not for speeding. It's because they think that you did some felony shit, and they're probably right. So what happened in this case is that police officers with the Criminal Interdiction Division in Louisville, Kentucky, they conducted a traffic stop. And as they conducted a traffic stop, a front seat passenger, a man named 250-pound guy named Marvin Smith, he fled the traffic stop on foot. I'm not sure what he was thinking or how far he thought he was going to get, but that's what he did. As Mr. Smith ran from the vehicle, and you might be wondering, well, why did Mr. Smith run? And we're going to go ahead and get to that here in a minute. But as Mr. Smith ran from police officers, he was holding a handgun in his hand that had an extended magazine. As he was running from police officers, and just watch the body camera video of this incident this morning, as he was running from police officers, one police officer yelled, over 20 times, I counted, to drop the gun. Mr. Smith did not listen, and he kept running from police officers. What the police officers claim is that as he was running away from them, that he was actually pointing the gun back at the officers as he was running, that he did this multiple times. Eventually, police officers did shoot him. He was struck multiple times. However, Mr. Smith did survive. Now, let's get to the claim of the police officers that while Mr. Smith was running away, that he was, still pointing the gun at police officers. Well, there actually is some evidence. There is some evidence of this on the body camera footage, because there was a light that was mounted to the gun, and you could see multiple times during the foot chase that while he was running away from police, that even though it's quick and it's body camera footage, so it's kind of shaky, but you can clearly see multiple times during the foot chase that the light that was mounted on this gun was pointed at police officers. So he was pointing the gun at police officers at multiple different times during this foot chase. Again, Mr. Smith was shot multiple times by police officers. However, he did survive. Now, the reason why he ran, so here's why. This is just an opinion. This is a theory of mine of why Mr. Smith ran from this particular traffic stop. It's because at the time of this incident, he was serving a home incarceration sentence, essentially house arrest. He had some felony charges, and the last portion of his sentence was going to be on house arrest. So Mr. Smith is supposed to be at home, not in a car that was being stopped by criminal drug interdiction officers. It turns out that the gun that he had was stolen, and both in the vehicle and on him, he did have some fentanyl. So he was charged with the stolen gun and for trafficking fentanyl. My guess is because he was on the home incarceration, he was trying to avoid that. Didn't make a whole lot of sense, but he did survive, and he is actually back in jail for those charges. All right, so those were the 3 officer-involved shootings that I wanted to talk about. Now, some of the top stories from 2023, and listen, we had a really great year. A couple of the really good things that happened is that we did get our YouTube award, a YouTube Creator Award that we have behind us for the content that we have here over on Cop Watch TV. So definitely want to thank all of our viewers. Because we wouldn't be here without you guys not only watching and participating in this live show, but also watching and sharing the incredible raw body camera footage that we put out every single week, and we'll continue to put out every single week on this channel. Now let's go ahead and talk about some of the top stories. This is just my opinion of what some of the top stories from 2023 are. So, one of the top stories from 2023 happened with the Laverne Police Department in Megan Hall, because it's Megan Hall. And one of the interesting developments in that case is that she's actually recently filed a lawsuit. She's claiming that she was groomed and taken advantage of by supervisors in the police department. She actually has a court date for that case in April of 2024. So we will definitely keep up on the Megan Hall lawsuit. And it kind of what I said about the time is that if you think that the Megan Hall case in Laverne, for the Laverne Police Department, as soon as that case came out and it basically got national attention, there were all kinds of amazing memes about this case. Just so you know, and I know this too, I'm 100% sure of this, is that there were hundreds of cops from dozens of police departments who were literally in the same situation, who were hoping that their case wasn't going to be highlighted next. That is still the case because it is nature at play, and I promise you that will be the case going forward. The other case that I want to talk about is probably the top story of the year. If the top story of 2022, if that's top story was Uvalde, which is basically a perfect example of a failure of a police response to an active shooter at a school, then the top story of 2023 has to be the Nashville police officers who responded to an active shooter at a school. Their response was incredible, and that was absolutely 100% the top law enforcement story of the year, was the heroic Nashville police officers at the officer-involved shooting and how they handled it. It was incredible. It was 100% an example of how police officers should respond to and deal with monsters at an active shooter. Some good news. So we did have some good news this year. I know most of the cases that we cover are officer-involved shootings, which, again, no matter what someone did or what crime someone committed, we obviously don't want anyone to lose life or be injured. One of the reasons why we do this show and we have these discussions is to try to see what can we do, what policies, what laws, what tactics, what can be put in place so there's less violence between police officers and citizens. That's really the goal of all this. So a lot of what we cover, aren't great stories. because of there is some loss of life or some injury to someone. However, there was some good news that did come out of this year. Some of the good news was the Ben Darby case. So Ben Darby was the officer who was charged in I believe it was Alabama, and he was basically in jail for the murder of someone who had pointed a gun at him. He actually won his appeal earlier this year after serving a couple years in prison. Ben Darby won his appeal, and basically after his appeal, he worked out an agreement with prosecutors to where he pled guilty to manslaughter, credit time served, and probation. Their social media tag everywhere is Stand with Darby, him and his wife Keelan. They always put up updates, but the fact that Ben Darby is out of prison and free, I'm going to say that was one of the good things that happened in 2023. Also, we had Kim Potter was released from prison as well. Kim Potter was the 26-year police vet in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, who was involved in an officer-involved shooting with an individual named Dante Wright, who was resisting a lawful arrest and fighting with police officers. Kim Potter was the officer who had the case of taser confusion, where she basically picked up her handgun instead of her taser. Around the country since 2000, this happens about once a year. It was not intentional, and none of it would have happened if Dante Wright did not resist arrest and try to fight with police officers. Had he just been a normal, decent human and gone to jail for his warrant, none of this would have happened. Kim Potter served just under 3 years in prison. She was released earlier this year. I hope Kim has a good retirement after having to serve a couple years in prison. And the last bit of good news that I want to highlight is basically some content that had been created by Liz Collin and Dr. J.C. Chase. Basically, Liz Collin was a former news reporter in the Minneapolis area. Her husband is Bob Kroll. During the George Floyd incident, Bob Kroll was not only was he a sergeant with the Minneapolis Police Department, he was also the head of the police union. Basically, not only did he have to retire, but she was actually fired from, or she left her job as a news anchor after doing it for over a decade. She wrote a book called They're Lying, which basically details a lot of the ancillary issues around the George Floyd case, and they actually just created a documentary that's free almost everywhere called The Fall of Minneapolis. There's a different side to all this when it comes to what really happened and some of the narratives around it. I think that the fact that there are people out there in this space or in the police space that are putting out information that is outside of just what Ben Crump and Keith Ellison say. So the book is called They're Lying. It's fantastic, and the documentary is called The Fall of Minneapolis. I watched it a couple weeks ago. It is absolutely incredible. I hope everybody goes to watch it. And that was Liz Collin and Dr. J.C. Chase. Now, some of the cases that I'm following going into 2024. So some of the cases that I'm following are the most important cases that I think we're going to have some resolution to going into 2024. And the number one has to be the Daniel Penny case. So the Daniel Penny case that happened in New York City this past year, he was the Marine who was on the subway, and homeless crazy guy named Jordan Neely was threatening passengers, and Daniel Penny put him in some type of a hold, in order to restrain him, and Jordan Neely ended up dying, and Daniel Penny was charged with manslaughter. So Daniel Penny has gotten a lot of support. I know there are millions of dollars that are in there for his defense fund, but he is currently being charged with manslaughter. I think it's absolutely, we covered that case a lot on this channel. I think it's absolutely ridiculous that he is facing any charges at all, and be really curious to see what happens in the Daniel Penny case. Other police officer involved shootings, that officers that have been charged that I'm following, is the one case happened in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Hasn't gotten a whole lot of national attention, but it's got not even so much local attention. This happened in Las Cruces, New Mexico. The officer is Officer Brad Lunsford, and the individual who he ended up shooting, killing, his name was Presley Easy, Easy-E. So this is a case where, Officer Lunsford had made contact with Mr. Easy after shoplifting some beer, I believe. There was a lawful arrest. Not only did Presley Easy, he resist arrest from the police officer, but during the fight with police officers, he actually grabbed control and had control of the officer's taser. It was at that point that Officer Lunsford utilized deadly force. I've covered this when people take control of a police officer's taser, the idea that that is a deadly force situation and deadly force is warranted, and that is what police officers should do in a situation like that. That this is a controversial issue that seems like it isn't going away. Last year we had the case with Garrett Rolfe, where his charges were dismissed for something very similar when he shot and killed, I believe, an individual named Daryl Brooks. After Daryl Brooks took possession of his taser and tried to fire the taser at him, those charges were dismissed. The same thing should happen in this case. The other case is also Officer Christopher Schur that happened in Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Officer Christopher Schur, he shot and killed Patrick Loyola, and he is currently facing second-degree murder charges. I've also covered the Patrick Loyola case a lot on this channel as well. That actually happened before the Patrick Easy case in Las Cruces, New Mexico, with the same kind of thing. During a lawful arrest, Patrick Loyola fought with Officer Schur and gained control of the taser. It was at that point that Officer Schur utilized deadly force. So the Daniel Penny, Presley Easy, and then Officer Christopher Schur, those are the three cases that I'm going to be tracking most from 2023 into 2024. I want to thank everyone for being a part of our live shows, and I hope that everyone has a great and safe New Year's. We will see you back here next Friday for the show, first one of the new year. And again, have a nice and safe and happy New Year. Thank you.